To the second panel about changing behavior, interdisciplinary lessons. And during this panel, we're going to talk about behavior and preferences. And after what we learned during the first panel, we're going to talk about what we can actually do to change people's behavior and hopefully improve the world. So, I grew up on an organic farm in Wisconsin, and I developed certain values and beliefs about the way we interact with the world and the way our food systems exist and the way we interact with those food systems. But a lot of people don't have those same beliefs. A lot of people didn't grow up on farms. And so how do we instill those same values and beliefs in other people who didn't have the same experiences? So these are the things that we're going to be talking about during this panel. So I am going to let the panelists speak. They each have 5 minutes, but it looks like Debbie Prentice is not at her seat. Is she in the audience somewhere? Is Debbie Prentice here?
I think we would know if she were here.
Oh, dear. Okay, well, we are going to try to get in contact. Hey, Debbie! Fabulous. Okay.
Don't mind me.
Well, now that we have everybody here, we can get started. So I'd like to introduce Christina Roberto to give her first introduction.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It's really a delight to be here. I was an undergrad at Princeton, so I have really fond feelings. It's always nice to come back. I just want to give you a little bit of background. These comments will be very brief. So I am trained as a psychologist and epidemiologist, and I direct the PEACH Lab, the Psychology of Eating and Consumer Health Lab at Penn. And the goal of that work is really trying to identify policies and interventions to promote healthy choices. But the lens through which I've been doing that has been really focused on public health, so obesity and chronic diseases. And I haven't thought too much about climate change until recently. And now I'm starting to collaborate and do more in that space. And what really excites me about those collaborations is this realization that we have very much shared goals, right? So goals around environmental sustainability and healthy eating, there's a ton of overlap there. I would like people to eat less red meat because there's really good data suggesting it's bad for your health. People who focus on climate change and sustainability want the same thing. And so I think these kinds of forums are a really nice way to bring people together and think about, all right, how do we partner on this? Our panel, I think part of the goal of our panel is to think about why changing behavior, especially eating behavior, can be so challenging. And I'll just give you a few thoughts around that. The reason I study obesity is it's an enormously complicated problem, and I really like that and find that interesting. So I'm not going to be able to outline all the reasons why I think this is hard, but I'll just give you some highlights. So I think we have three vulnerabilities here that are interacting with a pretty toxic environment. We have biological ones, we have psychological ones, and we have social and economic vulnerabilities. So let's start with biological vulnerabilities. Salt, sugar, and fat. They are very tasty, right? Biologically, we are designed to really like them. There's a lot of emerging research right now that suggests that certain foods might even have an addictive potential. Sometimes just because they have ingredients like caffeine that we know to be addictive, but people are starting to figure out that even if not addictive, people can really develop habitual behaviors around these that are very hard to break. And there's even some data suggesting there's a biology here around young kids. Young kids actually have a preference for sweeter foods than adults, and that's troubling because it means they can get hooked sort of earlier on to some of those sweeter foods. There's also a ton of psychological vulnerabilities that interact with our environment. So we're very likely to engage in what people call mindless eating, the sort of automatic, habitual eating, which would be fine if you were surrounded by fruits and vegetables all the time and you were mindlessly munching on them. But we know in our current environment that's not the case. We're really influenced by contextual cues that can be very subtle. So an example would be portion sizes, right? If I just serve you something in a large bowl, regardless of how hungry or full you feel, you're just more likely to eat more than if I served you it in a smaller bowl. And food marketing, right? Food marketing is really pervasive. It's really well done and engaging, and it hits on our emotions, and we can be very influenced by that, and unfortunately it's everywhere. And then this final point about other vulnerabilities, we also have a lot of social and economic vulnerabilities that interact in problematic ways with our environment. So people talk a lot about the cost of healthy food and the expense there. There's targeted marketing, so there are some groups disproportionately impacted by obesity that companies really try to target with marketing. And there's stress. If you live in an impoverished environment, there's stress that comes along with that. And then I think we can all relate to the sort of feeling stressed out and wanting some comfort food. And I think that's just so exacerbated when you're in certain kinds of environments. So I have this little guy at the bottom there, and the framework I think about this is we have these environmental drivers that cause us to overeat and make choices that are either less healthy or not terribly environmentally sustainable, but it interacts with these vulnerabilities, the biological ones, the psychological ones, the social and economic ones. We then overconsume these foods, and we develop preferences, and then we keep demanding them. And I think that's our problem. We're in this sort of vicious cycle, and it can be enormously challenging to break. So I'll just wrap up the comments with thinking about, so how do we break it? How do we change behavior? And sometimes it comes up like the grassroots level in individuals, local food movement or slow food would be examples of that. Oftentimes we can do it through policy, and then industry has a role to play and can obviously shape behavior. I'll leave with just one example to kind of kick this off that we think a lot in public health to illustrate the power of policy. So food is very different than smoking, and I don't mean to try to equate the two or simplify it, but smoking is one of the greatest public health victories we've had. There's still a lot to be done. There's certainly a lot to be done internationally, but a lot of that story is a policy story, right? We implemented taxes, we have clean indoor air laws, restriction on marketing, huge mass media campaigns, warning labels, and it changed social norms, which ends up being a very powerful way to shape behavior. It's a little bit hard to know, what comes first. I tend to think that policies can shape norms, and so once you implement some of those, some of that change follows. So my personal bias when I'm thinking about obesity, and again, I haven't thought a ton about environmental sustainability, but I really think we need policy change at this point. I think it's just, I think we need all three, but I think where we've been lacking is policy change, and I have a feeling that that's probably true for sustainability efforts as well. So I think all three have a role to play, but I think without the policy, there's just not a lot of incentives there. Okay, so I'll end with the picture of peaches in my lab, and we'll turn it over to the other panelists. Thank you.
All right, and next we have Elke Weber. Two slides. Yep.
Well, thank you for being here on a Friday. About 6 years ago, I actually was privileged to be part of a 5-day gathering that was designed to inform His Holiness the Dalai Lama about global challenges, climate change, food consumption, planetary boundaries in general. And after 2 days of presentations, like the ones we heard earlier today, His Holiness, who's not only extremely spiritual, extremely funny, but also extremely rational, sort of basically turned to us and says, well, now that we know what the problem is, we should just fix it. And so my task was then to convince His Holiness that it's not quite so simple. That sort of the challenge that we face in order to motivate action, whether it's in terms of food consumption or greater sustainability and all of these other dimensions, it's not just an information barrier. It's not just telling people what the problem is, but it's also to motivate change on more psychological dimensions. And so what enables action? And why don't we act on these global challenges that are right in front of us? So not to say that then there are no information barriers. Of course there are, and that's why we have science and it needs to be done. But on top of that, also, when you ask people to change, there are cognitive barriers and there are motivational barriers. The cognitive barriers means that there's only so much attention to go around. We have to worry about keeping our jobs, getting our assignments in on time, making sure our marriages are intact, our kids sort of do well, and sort of worrying about climate change or even worrying about the kind of food that we eat is not oftentimes very high on our agenda. And on top of that, many of the behaviors we are trying to change are automatic. So you don't even think about them as something that is modifiable. It just clicks in. You get hungry, you reach for the cookie jar. And so how do we change something, a behavior that people don't even consider as actionable? And certainly incentives are not necessarily going to do that to you. So on top of that, the motivational barriers to change. The problems oftentimes that we're facing are not very salient. Healthy eating is only going to become, or unhealthy eating, I should say, is only going to become an issue down the road. It's not going to sort of basically get you an electric shock right away. Climate change is even worse. Fortunately for us, many of the symptoms are lying in the future. They're statistical at this point. They're not concrete. They're not vivid. And so we don't get the kind of early warning signal that other kinds of dangers provide us with in order to motivate action. So then what does enable action? I think this session will basically touch on them. The biggest problem is that we have too many goals. Very few of us want to basically sort of end up with a heart attack. Very few of us want to destroy the planet that we're living in. The problem is that other goals get in the way. We also want to have our cake now and eat it. We want to have that nice taste. We want to use our air conditioning so we can get things done in a pleasant environment. And so given that there's goal conflict, and so many of them, I think sort of one solution in many contexts is to just activate those goals that are in people's long-term interest, because the goals that are in our short-term interest are chronically more activated for whatever evolutionary reasons. And so to help people to remember that it's important to think more sustainable, to eat better. Then the question becomes, what makes these goals active? And so basically, some of them are automatically activated, chronically active, but some of them also are influenced by culture, by child rearing, and some of them are influenced by our environment. And I think those are probably the ones that we have most immediate opportunity to change. And so reminders of important goals out there, visually or auditorily, measurable progress. We love to make progress. One of the reasons video games are so addictive, because there's always a chance of doing better in the next round. Well, we can turn many of our behaviors into video games if we provide people with feedback that they're actually advancing or getting further away from a goal. And good labels help. Good metrics are a stepping stone on that dimension. There are different ways of really motivating more forward-looking actions. We don't make decisions just with our heads, cost-benefit calculations. Oftentimes we make decisions with our hearts, with feelings. And to think about positive ways of framing behavior change, I think is really important, because none of us wants to be nagged all the time about something. There's a tendency to turn away from negative messaging. Also, we oftentimes make decisions by following rules. This gets back to this notion of habits. Habits are just if-then kind of statements, but also there are other kinds of rules. We oftentimes imitate what other people are doing, especially people that we respect. And so social norms can also play that function, or just sort of basically modeling desirable behavior. What does Angelina Jolie do? And so depending, and we have to find the right kind of messengers for different groups of people. So let me just sort of show you the example with which I was trying to convince the Dalai Lama that things are not necessarily just rational and not just an information deficit. If you go to a conference in the United States, and as you know, there are millions of conferences in this country, oftentimes you can sort of pre-register for what kind of luncheon you get. And typically there's a vegetarian option, and there's also a beef option, and a chicken option, and something else. And so the question is, how many people on average pre-register for the vegetarian lunch? And as you can see, it's relatively small. It's 5%. It's also typically not very tasty, but what you get is a steam table vegetable that comes with the chicken or with the beef option. And so there's another conference, which is called BEC, Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change. And the attendees at this conference, as you can imagine, are very well informed about the consequences of eating meat, in particular eating beef, as we heard earlier in the session. And so the question is, well, what is the increase in people who pre-order the vegetarian option in this audience who cannot be accused of any information deficit? And as you can see, it's actually quite impressive, right? It triples. It goes from 5% to 17%. Now, in 2009, the organizer of the conference, who actually was sort of trained in behavioral sciences, said, well, why don't we just pre-check the vegetarian option on the registration form? Basically make it the default. Just the way we have, for example, organ donation being the default option in half the European countries. It doesn't take away any of your choice autonomy. If you want to have that beef and entree, it's just one click of the button to change it, the way you would pre-click it even if nothing was pre-checked. So the question is, what's the increase now for this audience who were already well informed by just changing the default? And it's actually quite significant. It goes up to 80%. So let me just sort of finish up and saying that awareness is not necessary. and certainly not sufficient for environmental action. And maybe we're putting too much pressure on people, sort of by having them premeditate all of these things. We should think about more passive ways of helping them, and keeping intentions active when they're there. Also using more passive ways of helping people make decisions that are in their long-run interest, framing things positively, and also provide better solutions at the individual, but I completely agree, also at the social and institutional and political level, to put the kind of behavior change that we need into action in the time period that's necessary for sustainability in the long run. Thank you so much.
So I'm going to be bold and speak without PowerPoint slides. I want to offer a few insights from my field of specialization, which is social psychology. Both of my colleagues gave wonderful overviews of just how daunting and complicated this problem is. And I think looking at it as a social psychologist has two advantages, just as a social, focusing just on the social psychological aspects. And I'll explain what those are in just a sec. But it has two advantages. One is I think there are particular insights, there are particular aspects of the problem that we tend to miss that this level of analysis brings out. The other is it's very actionable. So just as Elke just described, a very simple experiment, social psychologists love very simple experiments. And I think for incredibly complex, multifaceted, multi-layered problems, we just have to start somewhere, right? It's very, very easy to be daunted by how overdetermined our bad eating habits are. But as with smoking, and I too really love the smoking example, not because it's analogous in particulars with this, but because it is an example of how one thing led to another, and things that early on were inconceivable, that you couldn't imagine being different, eventually became first conceivable and then natural, right? And that's the way these kinds of widespread, culturally ingrained, overdetermined behaviors, that's how they change. They change bit by bit, and generation of children by generation of children, and intervention effort by intervention effort, and law by law, and incentive by incentive, and it really does, over time, things that were at one point inconceivable eventually become natural. So what's social psychology? The core insight of social psychology is that people are hugely influenced by what their behavior signifies in the eyes of others, what they think others in the same situation are doing, and what their behavior means for important relationships with friends, with loved ones, with enemies, with power holders. I mean, all valences of relationships, right? Food consumption is a quintessentially social activity in all sorts of ways. So if we want to change eating habits, we need to consider not just people behaving as individuals, but also as members of families, friendship groups, eating clubs, dining halls, communities, conference attendees, and so on, right? So social psychology as a field got started really during World War II. The foundational work was done then. And I wanted to tell you about the earliest study that I know of how social psychological factors influence eating behaviors, to illustrate sort of the lens that I think this field offers. And this is a study by the founder of social psychology, Kurt Lewin. It's a very famous study. Where the question was actually how to get people during World War II to eat organ meat, okay? Lewin was called upon during World War II by the Committee on Food Habits to help increase consumption of unattractive but nutritious foods, including hearts, kidneys, livers, and intestines. His first insight actually was that to get people to eat these foods, you need to get them onto the table, right? If people will eat what's in front of them, you need somehow to get these meats in front of them. And who were the gatekeepers here but the housewives, right? Those were the people who shopped, who cooked, and who served dinner to their families. So really, you weren't just persuading anybody. You were persuading the gatekeepers, the ones who controlled the food. Now, you can imagine anybody here who serves food to a family. I mean, if I ever served intestines to my kids, it would be over, right? So it's not that was not a small hurdle, but at least that's a target, right? You can get your arms around that. So Lewin did a very simple experiment in which housewives were either exposed to a 45-minute lecture, like I'm giving you now, emphasizing the importance of eating meats for the war effort, the nutritional qualities of meats, their economic advantages, or he had these women participate in 45-minute group discussions in which they essentially persuaded themselves and each other. Okay, so there was a facilitator who began with an introduction about the importance of maintaining health during the war, and housewives were asked, do you think people like you, housewives like yourselves, could be persuaded to participate in the intestinal meat program? I have to say they didn't know about branding then. That's not what I would have called it. But the housewives then proceeded to discuss the utility of consuming organ meats, how to get housewives such as themselves to use them. Follow-up interviews indicated that only 3% of the housewives who heard the lecture served organ meats to their families, but 32% of those who participated in the discussion groups did so. Okay, so it's another example. It's like the defaults, right? It's a little thing, but it's really psychologically powerful and therefore behaviorally powerful. This study was done a long, long time ago, obviously. Subsequent work has built on it in all sorts of ways. And I'm not going to tell you about all of that. I just wanted to illustrate, I just wanted to say, A, this problem's been around for quite a while, and we can actually learn quite a lot from earlier efforts. And B, that thinking about just at a very concrete behavioral level, the social contexts in which eating occurs and who serves the food and what prevents people from checking the vegetarian option and what determines what gets put in front of people and how much of it there is, right? That level of analysis, it seems so pedestrian compared to, all of the ingrained kinds of habits that we have to overcome. But we can do it. So let's tackle that. And surprisingly enough, the ingrained habits will come along. I just want to end by highlighting 3 core questions that I think changing eating behavior should address. Okay. Number 1, what do sustainable eating habits signal about me as a person, right? What is the identity of somebody who cares about this issue? Note that identity can be both positive and negative. Okay, so vegetarians, for example, are perceived to have strong communal values and regard for others, which is all good. But on the flip side, they're perceived to be morally superior, judgmental, and sort of annoying. And no, it's true, especially by meat eaters, right? Well, because they're sitting there eating some veggie burger, and there you are with, it just feels very uncomfortable, right? So, and the point is, to the extent that we derogate them for all their goodness, right, we're not persuaded by them. We're not influenced by them. They're not the relevant people for telling us what we should be doing. So we need to think about identity. It's incredibly important in this context. Second, how are people influenced in their eating by what those around them are eating? How can we change these social norms, right, to change their behavior? Both Elke and Christina mentioned this. This is a favorite of mine. It's my area of expertise as well, and I'm sure we'll have time to talk about it more in the discussion. And then 3, what role does food play in important relationships? And how does taking that into account shape our approach to behavior change? Housewives and house husbands and house elves still serve the food, right? Or they're still the gatekeepers. And food is still a communal practice in families and communities in various cultures. We need to understand the significance of food for those relationships. That's all for me.
Fabulous. Thank you, panelists, for speaking. We're going to move to the Q&A section of this panel. And so I'm going to invite audience participation. People can come down to the microphones. Also, we have a link to this poll everywhere. And if you're really shy and you don't want to get up and speak in front of a microphone, you can go to this website right here on your smartphone or your laptop, and you can just submit a question digitally. I'd prefer if you came down and spoke into the microphone. I think everybody likes, speaking face-to-face. But if you want to be anonymous and say something on a computer, you can totally do that, and I will have the questions here. So, yeah, let's just go ahead with audience questions.
Hi. Thank you so much for all your information. It was fascinating. My question is actually for Christina. You touched on an idea that policy is what you're interested in, what you think is one of the solutions. And I was wondering what for you is a realistic policy change, the most important, and then what is your dream policy change?
Sure, yeah, and part of the reason I got to policy is I actually used to work with people, trained as a clinical psychologist in part, and so trying to help them lose weight and seeing the frustration in doing that, and looking at the literature and realizing that it was really hard to change behavior. And so I've evolved over time to think we really need these policies. So I can comment from an obesity and public health perspective. There's a bunch of things that folks in that world hope will happen, including myself. So one thing that's been really interesting right now are these sugary drink taxes. There's one in Philly. I'm actually doing an evaluation of it right at this moment as we speak. But they're happening all over the country now. They're kind of catching fire. We don't know. We don't know if that'll be an effective strategy, but we suspect it's likely to decrease sugary drink purchases. So I really like Debbie's point of we have to take some small steps and start somewhere and then evaluate and figure out how it's going. People have talked a lot about restrictions on marketing, which is an enormously hard thing to do in this country, but other countries are doing it, specifically child-targeted marketing. So having some criteria where you can't market certain foods during kids' television programming if they don't meet a certain threshold. I think what we've seen with the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act in improving lunches and food in schools and maybe combining some behavioral efforts to encourage that is a really nice, optimistic thing. There are good things happening in industry too, so some voluntary partnerships to reduce sodium in the food supply, and one secret there is don't tell folks you're doing it, right? Just if the industry can start slowly tailoring down, and that's happening in England, and we're trying to get some progress there. But those are a few examples of, I think, exciting policies.
Hi, my question is for Debbie. You mentioned that there's a big question around the identity that one has if they choose to change their diets or to eat differently. And I guess my question is, must one choose to identify with an identity as opposed to being presented with opportunities to make individual daily choices that can make fantastic differences and not needing to change how they view themselves or how they are viewed by others, but just enjoy occasional or more frequent over time changes in their diets?
Yes, absolutely. You don't have to identify, you don't have to think of yourself that way. But other people will think of you that way, right? And so when when you're sitting on an airplane and you've ordered the special meal and the person next to you has not, they have feelings about that, even if you do not, right? Even if you did it just so that it will have been, not dead for a year, right? Which is at least one reason why a lot of people choose the vegetarian option. They'll, and that's, I think, the what I wanted to say about identity. People will assign you an identity, and I think green identity is one that has a very double-edged sword quality to it, right? If you drive an electric car, people who drive SUVs, you may not be trying to say anything with that behavior, but people who drive SUVs feel you as trying to say something about that behavior. And I think this is the one of the sort of core lessons of social psychology is that we're such incredibly finely tuned social animals, right? We're constantly watching each other and thinking about what this person's behavior means for my behavior and who am I in this community and who do I want to be. But it's hard to get away from that level, even if as an individual you want to just be.
All right, go ahead.
Thank you. I've been a vegetarian for over 40 years. And I would say 40 years ago, it was virtually impossible to eat at a restaurant. Most would not even consider a vegetarian option. These days, one can sometimes, but not always, get a vegetarian option. Generally, there is no clue about nutritional value of that option, and either one gets pasta or one gets a plate full of vegetables, sometimes just steamed. So my question is, what do you think is the role of restaurants in changing eating patterns? Should they be the leaders or the followers?
Maybe I could start with that. I think one of the advantages of the default example that I showed you about vegetarian options at conferences, when 80% of people actually order the vegetarian option, you can prepare a delicious one, which then also serves an educational function, because people realize that vegetarian food doesn't have to be tasteless, even though most of the time when we encounter it, it can be that way. So I think absolutely that sort of any kind of forum, including restaurants, sort of do have educational functions. What's encouraging is, now there's actually gourmet vegetarian or vegan cuisine, right? And so there are two Michelin stars, that are given to some restaurants, in New York City and other places. And I think sort of realizing that being a foodie and being vegetarian are not mutually exclusive options, I think is really important, And the same goes for cooking shows, and basically modeling, what vegetarian cooking would look like. Because again, we're creatures of habit. We cook what our mothers cooked, our grandmothers cooked, And so we need new role models, sort of if we want to substitute the old ones. That's not going to be a vacuum.
Can I just add to that? I think one of the big challenges is the black and white thinking around this at a societal level. Like, I'm a vegetarian or I'm not. And, vegetarians, that's a small proportion of the population. And really, we need the mindset to be even a little bit of meat reduction is helpful, right? And that you don't just have to say, I'm one or the other. And I think this comes up with restaurants, so there's some nice work in marketing around, you guys know the marketing jargon better, but vice virtue bundles, they talk about it. But I have a colleague who did a study where if you offer people French fries or you offer them salad, they want the French fries. But if you do a half and half, right, a salad and a little bit of the fries, then people much prefer that option, right? And so I think we're thinking very black and white about this, but those kinds of scenarios in restaurants could be very helpful.
You were here first. Go ahead.
Excuse me. This question is in the spirit of the title of this panel, which uses the word interdisciplinary. So I wonder what you all have to say about the role of the arts in affecting social change, particularly the visual arts. We live in a visual culture.
That's a fabulous question. Everybody's just like taking a minute to process.
Yeah, I mean, I can at least start on that. Visual cues are incredibly important. I mean, everything, the visual comes into play in all sorts of ways connected to what we talked about. The visual cues for what to eat and how much to eat and so on are significant. Advertising, visual advertising, has a huge role to play in making some things seem, more palatable, more desirable. But a less obvious, but I think equally significant way in which the visual matters is what we know of other people's behavior is what we see. It's what's made salient to us. And social norms, there's tons of research showing that social norms across all sorts of different kinds of behavior, social norms relating to all sorts of different kinds of behaviors depend entirely on what people see others doing, right? And that's whether they actually just see them in open spaces or whether visual artists are putting things in front of them that influence what they see. People's perceptions of reality obviously are mediated entirely by what gets in, and much of that is through the visual system. So I think it has a huge role to play.
Maybe just add a little bit to this. I've been working with artists more in the context of climate change than food consumption, and in part because climate change is just so much more abstract, right? And the arts are ways of making the abstract, making statistics real. You can turn statistics into stories, you can turn statistics into images, and we all know the iconic images, of the poor polar bears, but there's also habituation, and so we need to have a broader range, of visual or artistic stories. And I think it's really important to have not just dystopias, and we oftentimes try to motivate change and behavior change with dystopias, and everybody loves a good dystopia. I mean, there's nothing wrong with one, but we cannot just have those. We also need utopias, and we need concrete ways of showing people how we not just sort of want, not just where we want to be, how we can get from A to B. And I think, again, that's where the arts, whether it's like storytelling in terms of a play or a novel, or in terms of visual images, can really help us, showing us what these plausible paths are to getting us there, and role modeling behavior in that sense.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi. Sorry. Have any of you come across examples of successful social or policy-based programs from across the world that have actually led to a significant change in eating behaviors in different countries? And if you could shed a bit more light on what those programs were.
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that. I mean, so there are some examples of specific policy measures, and I'll give you a very concrete one, banning trans fat. So this happened in the U.S., but there are countries like Denmark that have got it out of the food supply, and it's basically coming out of our food supply. So trans fat, it's a specific type of fat where epidemiologists really realized that it was very highly linked with cardiovascular disease and problems. And you're starting to see rates of cardiovascular problems decreasing in countries like Denmark. And to me, the reason why I tend to harp on policy is this happened in New York City. It was the first place in the U.S. to get rid of it out of restaurants. And they actually tried first. They tried to work with restaurants and implore people and do some media campaigns. And then they were like, you know what, we're just going to do a policy. And it basically got levels of trans fat down to 0, whereas no sort of other solution would have got there. So I think what we're seeing are these examples of things being tried. And then you get some countries, like Japan is a very, very interesting, fascinating one. Their obesity prevalence is extremely low. So it's doubled in the last little while from 2% to 4%. Ours is 30%, right? So they actually don't have a lot of policies in place, but they have tremendous amount of social norms and pressure that we probably could never replicate here, which is why I think, but it's not to say the policies only work, but there's a lot to that culture that I think has really kept their obesity prevalence quite low.
Yeah, so we're completely oversaturated with information in all aspects of our life, and nutrition is definitely one of them. There's just so much information for people that are, I feel, actively trying to have a good diet. So what is the best way to inform people how to eat healthy?
Yeah, I'll jump in because I do a lot of research on communicating nutrition messages. And I agree. I think it's both the case that information is not enough, but that we also need well-designed information. And so I think a lot of these messages are not delivered in terribly effective ways, but you could imagine information being more useful depending on how it's presented. So here's a very concrete example. There's some research on traffic light food labels, right? This is a very intuitive, red means stop, green means go. You see it, you can immediately process it. And there's some nice data in a cafeteria setting where it's been able to shift purchases. Now, to me, that's more than just information. It's an in-the-moment, salient reminder right when you're making the choice, because it's right there on the food, as opposed to this abstract idea of, oh, yeah, like I know the dietary guidelines, but when I'm actually going to make the decision, I'm not reminded about it. It's not present in my mind. So I think there's a lot of need around how do we deliver these informational messages in more effective ways.
Yeah, let me add to that. Actually, in the Obama administration, they did a lot of work in the CDC on simplifying the presentation. So, some of you may be old enough to remember the food pyramid. I remember the food pyramid of what you were supposed to eat. And it was, you had to it took a week in school to explain to you what the food pyramid was. And I still don't fully understand it. They replaced that with a plate. Right, and what is a healthy meal? Well, a healthy meal is half fruits and vegetables, right? Well, that you can get, right? And the food pyramid sort of, produced that if you did all the calculations. Whereas, that's a much more vibrant, sort of intuitive way of presenting the information. They had I think they did a lot of actually very good work, informed by people's information processing limitations and what we could actually take in.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. As a registered dietitian, I just want to mention something that we are working actually to start educating our children about the benefits of fruits and vegetables. And also the school system that we are working around northern New Jersey is we present fruits and vegetables in a very colorful, the previous question about arts. And we also demonstrate how this can be tasty and delicious. And actually it is now one of the colleagues of mine is taking this message even to Korea, South Korea, and teaching the students in the school in South Korea about good vegetables and fruit. So we are taking this step up, one level up, to start with our younger generation to move forward. I think that's very important, the education of the young children, because they can even transfer to their parents how they should eat and what is this healthy diet is all about. So thank you very much.
Can we just comment on that? I think that's a really, really important point. And yeah, rather than trying to change bad habits, to instill good habits in the first place. And then also tying this, maybe comment to one of the earlier questions about the successful behavior change. One thing that happened very quickly in this country was the use of seatbelts. And within a couple of decades, very few of us actually feel safe without driving with those seatbelts. And that was very much mediated by children, first of all, being taught in school that should be done, and then nagging their parents to put on the seatbelt. Yeah. So.
Let me just add to that. I think what you're doing is so important, and we absolutely need to be doing it. At the same time, we do know that education alone in schools has not been enough, right? And there's been lots of studies on that. And so I think the best thing we could do is pair what you're doing with then you also influencing the school environment, and then you get this amazing synergy where, okay, the lunches are healthier, and it sounds like you're doing some of this experiential learning, and then I think that's where we'd really see growth, because if it's just the education and we stop there, I think it won't be enough.
Well, thank you guys for these fabulous questions and responses. Let's take a question over here.
Yeah, hi. We're talking a lot about changing behavior around food, and like these behaviors are long ingrained, have been there a long time, and yet the biggest change in eating habits in the world has only taken place over the last 50 or 70 years. We no longer eat like our grandparents. We eat this Western diet that somehow the whole world is getting addicted to, and I think a lot of this comes from industrial policy. I spent my life in the food industry. I think industrial policy has a lot more to do with this than, obviously I love sugar and I love fat and I'm going to go for that. But we've transformed, I'll give an example. I've been connected with some work in Tijuana, and 30 years ago the biggest problem in Tijuana was lack of calories. Now it's one of the fattest child cities in the world, There's huge changes going on in the world due to industrial policy that's creating huge differences in the way we eat. And it's not that people had habits they don't want to give up with. People are forming new habits. Diabetes has now surpassed AIDS as the biggest problem in Africa. That's due to the industrial diet, the Western diet that's taken over the world. So I thought maybe you might comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think there's many policies in a lot of different sectors that end up influencing this, and so we have seen this sort of Western diet exported. I do a lot of work in Guatemala, which is a very similar situation, where it used to be undernutrition is the main issue, and then you see this rising rate of obesity, and now overnutrition is going to be the primary issue. One upsetting thing from an obesity perspective is there's literally no country in the world that has been able to turn around their obesity epidemic. So all of that is just to say I agree with you. It's not just one or two policies. There's a lot going on here that's fueling it.
I want us to do a little thought experiment. We have the opportunity when our students come to university to influence their food eating habits because they're captive audience, right? And I know that we cannot feed everybody here at Princeton sustainably, drawing on all the food that's here locally. So What would that world look like, and what would we need to equip our students with in order for them to eat sustainably here?
I think we need our head of dining services, Smitha Hanif, here, who could actually answer that question. Because I don't actually know.
Well,
the answer
I guess
to that
maybe
question.
just if you want to focus on the behavior change that we would have to implement here on campus in order for our students to consistently choose a meal 3 times, 4 times a day that's healthy and sustainable.
You know, I think they do what are called nudges in the dining halls, right? If you notice, there's, they do them unevenly. Some dining halls are better than others. So some dining halls, you actually have to look really hard to find the unhealthy desserts. They tend to put salads up front. They tend to put fresh fruits and vegetables up front. There are a variety of the so-called nudges, right, about organizing the cafeteria, the food in the cafeteria. And they certainly do offer many more healthy and vegetarian alternatives than they used to. But going beyond that, I mean, in terms of, for example, the hours at which food is served and so on and so forth, I think, you know, there's a strong, the counter pull of wanting to give people choice and maintain that choice is very strong.
I should just mention that Smitha will be here for our luncheon panel, so you can put her on the spot then.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, one thing to think about too is, and I'm working with the dining hall in Penn, and I know there's been a lot of these kinds of studies, but I feel like I'm just thinking about when I worked with patients and we were trying to get them to make different choices, and oftentimes it was one simple message to just focus on. And so I wonder if it's red meat, if it's really trying to reduce meat consumption, and the dining halls just double down and say, like, we're not going to try to make all these different choices and people shift in all these different ways. We're just going to focus on this one goal, and we're not going to try to, you know, eradicate meat eating. And then it's messages about it and nudges about it, and you're doing lots of things for this one goal and just starting there. I think that can be easier than trying to say we're going to shift a whole diet.
I think this is a great question, and as a student, very pertinent to my life here at Princeton. I'd like to bring in an online comment, which is related to this question, and it's about students going vegetarian at college. And so this commenter comments, many students become vegetarian at college, but revert to their normal diet when they go out into the real world because of time, cost, energy, and lack of skills. So how does this help us understand the problem? So what are some of the barriers that we could understand because of this, reverting back to their original diets after graduation?
So maybe part of that refers to this competition for attention that I was alluding to, right? And so, I mean, I think during college, actually, you have, to some extent, you have the luxury of focusing on sort of maybe higher level goals and higher level needs that you have. And some of that goes away when you face the necessity of running a family and having a full-time job. And so our attention then gets diverted. And I guess maybe what that suggests is that we have to maybe develop sort of stronger habits, yeah, or maybe more social support, yeah, to maintain those behaviors down the road. It's not going to happen automatically, I guess, is a takeaway. Yeah?
We need more vegetarian fast food restaurants.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I don't want everyone to worry. I was eating at CAP as an undergrad, and I definitely lost weight after. So there's some hope after college that you'll eat healthier, too.
All right, go ahead.
So I think you guys have all given us brilliant general advice, a few good examples, but I want to put you on the spot. So if you're, you know, our focus is on reducing emissions, particularly through reducing beef consumption or ruminant meats. So what are the 1 or 2, using your general knowledge, what would be the 1 or 2 most specific recommendations you could have? For example, if you had policy, we were talking about the importance of policy, what would that policy be? With trans fats, it's kind of easy, right? Because you basically say, get rid of the trans fats, use some other fat. Probably hard to tell people they can't eat meat. So what would be the 1 or 2 things that, based on your general knowledge, you might try to do in this space?
Maybe one simple solution has to do with serving sizes, right? I mean, there's sort of nothing wrong with having a steak every once in a while, but does it really have to be, you know, like a pound of beef that you're eating? I mean, the desire to have, you know, a certain taste, you know, can just easily be satisfied with half the size, or even a quarter of the size. We also know that sort of people fill up their plates, and there's a lovely study by Brian Wansing basically saying that if you have smaller plates in the house, sort of you're going to eat less. And so, of course, eating less, sort of especially is true for certain kinds of food, consumption like food, but it's also, sort of good in general to eat less. So I think sort of, reducing the size of our plates might be a very simple intervention.
I mean, again, I've been thinking about this from an obesity perspective, and I realize there's overlap, there's not perfect overlap, but I personally think there's no shortage of policy ideas from the local to the federal level, right? So, yeah, so right now in obesity, we're taxing sugary drinks. There are grassroots movements around procurement policies, so government, for example, if it's a government building, what they're buying and serving in those buildings, there's requirements on that now. There are hospitals that are doing that. There are local government policies to ban sugary drinks on the property. There was the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act to make sure there's nutritional requirements in place at schools. Restrictions on marketing is one to think about, is there somewhere that we could go there? I mean, mass media campaigns, it's not a policy, but it's government funded. I mean, I actually feel like, God, the ideas are, there's tons. It's hard to say the problem is no one is going to be the slam dunk, and I think that's true for climate change also. You're going to have to do a bunch of things. But yeah, I mean, that's just a few that come to mind.
Debbie, you want to add a few?
I don't really I don't have really any to add. What I would say is anything that keeps meat from being in front of people will keep them from eating it. And I mean to be so simplistic, but given the amount of people's food that they eat out of convenience, if you make meat inconvenient, it will go away, right? And you can do that in a variety of ways, obviously. But that generally, I think, would be my only suggestion.
Let me just say one other. A low-hanging fruit, too, could be labeling policies. They tend to have a lot of political support. It's sort of an informational strategy, and designing a really good label that's bringing in health and environmental sustainability. You're never going to get huge effects. A label's not going to, tremendously change things, but it starts to change norms, and you probably will get something. And so that's a low-hanging fruit one.
I don't know who's next, but okay, go ahead.
I think I was next. I realize this is a high-level policy discussion and conference, but I'd like to throw something else in here, and that, well, here's an observation. I've managed a local farmers market around here for the last 15 years. And I finally figured out that there is a code that particularly young women with young families used when they came up to the market. They would say, now they're there at a farmer's market, right? Because they're trying to make healthy choices. And they would say, can you put that in a salad? And I finally figured out that what they meant was they don't know how to cook. They don't know how to cook. So all these, and aside from the fact that we're so busy and I was a working mom in my day too, so I know what it feels like to come home at 6 o'clock with the screen. But you can cook a meal in 15 or 20 minutes if you know what you're doing. So on the behavioral change side of things, I'm reminded, and I think I'm older than most of you on the panel, of Julia Child when she came in the 70s on television and changed the way American women cooked, and men, hugely, as some people would say. So I just want to know what you think about that. I mean, if you want people to change their behavior, we want people to change their behavior. So doesn't it start in the kitchen?
Great question. Any comments? Yeah.
I'll take my answer from my seat. Maybe I won't.
Right.
No.
So I really struggle with this because, I absolutely agree with you. It would be wonderful if, cooking education has come out of the schools and it should be back. I personally love to cook, but I also work a lot and find it difficult. And so I struggle with, do we want to try to go back in time and try to reinstate this and help people understand, or do we say, okay, moving forward, people are probably going to cook less, and so what are the opportunities given that? And I think there are a lot of industry opportunities given that. And so you are seeing, to Debbie's point before, many more restaurants and takeout places that are trying to offer healthier options that are quick and convenient. You've got concepts like, what Doug Rao, the former president of Trader Joe's, is doing in some low-income areas in Boston where, it's the daily table and they're trying to take food waste and make these delicious, nutritious meals, but they're convenient and people can just go and pick them up. And so I agree with you. I would hate to say, forget it. I think cooking is so important. But I think there's a certain reality that we're probably not going to go back, and there's a lot of good reasons that we don't want to go back to the 1950s. And so where are there new opportunities to help people with this?
And this sort of relates to another comment online, so I just want to sort of bring this discussion in as well. This comment asks about food education at Princeton, because it is so important for kids to learn about food and cooking foods. And so this question is about what Princeton can do for students relating to food. And from personal experience, One Princeton is putting on this conference, which I think is fabulous, and gets other people and students actively engaged in this conversation. But last year there was a course called Science, Society, and Dinner, and students, I think there were 12 students participating in this course, myself being one, and we had Chef Craig Shelton come in and actually teach us how to cook. He's a professional chef who I believe is here today, over here. And so students were actually able to get their hands on real wholesome food, practice cooking it, and then also learn about the environmental impacts of these foods. And so how we can cook wholesome food and make it taste delicious. And so we were having meals every other Monday night that were the most delicious food that I had at Princeton, and we cooked it, part of it. So those are just some ways I think that institutions can get engaged in teaching students some really necessary skills about food education.
My question is related to kind of the complexity of the decision of what to eat, right? At any given moment, we have various vectors of values that are coming into this. So if it's a while till payday, someone's making a decision based on the cost of food. If just in the first panel, we were talking about the difference between intensively grazed beef and pasture grazed beef, and the different trade-offs. And so I might be deciding to eat chicken because I think it's processed in a different way than beef. And one of the things that labels and decisions like to decide you're a vegetarian or a vegan, it makes those decision vectors a little bit easier to navigate, right? Because you choose, a red light on a high sugary food, but then there's another trade-off. And so I think one of the reasons that food is such a persistent problem, and I teach a class sort of related to ethical eating, and by the end of it, my students literally don't know what to eat, And I had a mom say, I don't care what you eat, but you have to eat something, because you care about all of these range of things, and it's fraught. And so I wonder what the science and the data, the behavioral science says on how do you help people negotiate a really kind of fraught, complicated decision-making structure in which any moment, kind of comfort food could be most important this day, or ethical eating could be most important this day. And how do you help people to move through those multiple layers to get to a consistent practice?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in, and I'm thinking about this too in the context of working with patients. Look, I think Elke just made such an important point around our attention span and our ability to hold a lot of things in our head. And so I think on an individual level, we need pretty simple messages and rules of thumb that people can sort of adhere to. And it might be something like, okay, I'm a person that doesn't drink soda. And I pretty much don't, and I occasionally do because that's okay. And so it might be a philosophy of, I try not to eat too much meat. I don't drink sugary drinks. I appreciate that everything, in moderation, I can have a little bit of things, and then maybe pick one more thing you try to focus on and care about. I think people really need some basic, simple rules to try to adhere to, and then also not beat yourself up, because you've had some cake and then you're feeling guilty. And I appreciate that the nutrition world hasn't done a great job of distilling that into a few messages. Just funny because I mean, the data for so long has supported, a lot of these basic things, fruits and vegetables, and somehow it gets really complicated. But I think at the core, you can find a few rules that aren't that complicated and are reasonably easy to stick to.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all of that, and I think a lot of eating is very habitual, right? People have the thing they do if they're at work or at school, and they have the place they go, and they have the thing they typically buy, right? I think training some of those habits to be healthy options and just simplify it for people. The other thing I think to recognize is that people don't know what they eat. And there are lots of studies where you actually have people keep a diary of what they eat, right? They can do that and they can be very accurate. But if you're not keeping a diary, which most of us are not, people are not all that aware of what they eat. So making them aware and training some habits, I think, are fairly straightforward ways to go.
Great. Next question.
So we have been talking about this morning about a lot of things and switching diets and everything. And for me, everything that you said sounds very painful. And so, you can probably guess from my accent that I'm French. So we like to eat, and it's a cultural thing. It's a social interaction, and we are kind of losing that with the time. We don't really have time to eat, and so it's moving forward. So I'm and I also travel a lot, and I remember going to some countries where they don't mind mixing potato with rice, and that's part of the meal. And I'm just wondering if education is the only solution. I think at some point, if we want to educate people which are probably less educated, so we come back to the fact where we should educate people that are less educated, but they will still be less educated. But I'm just wondering what's the part of culture versus education, which I make totally different. If you come from South America, you have a certain culture, you will probably eat a lot of rice and everything. And, if you are like a student and you come back home, the first thing that you do when you leave college, if you don't know how to cook, is to call your mom, and mom, what do you do for dinner tonight? How do I cook rice? Or how do I cook potato? Well, how do I cook meat? So I'm just wondering what's part of the culture in the behavior compared to the part of education, and what can we do about that?
It's a great question. Thank you.
So I don't know if this directly gets at your question. I do think, I don't want to speak for the other panelists, but I do think part of the message is this does not just have to be an education story. What was neat about the data Elke showed is there was no education there. There was it was just, look, we're very susceptible to the way options are presented to us. And so I wouldn't want you to walk away thinking, we've got to double down on educating people. I think we need to be more creative about policies, right? So banning trans fat has zero to do with education. You just keep doing what you're doing, but it's not really in the food supply. And the other point I would make, which I think speaks to a French perspective, there was this nice study that was done in a bunch of cafeterias where basically they implemented a lot of different nudges in terms of, okay, put the salad at the front of the line and the smaller plates, and let's try to get kids to eat healthier. And that was one arm of the study. But then there was another arm that brought in chefs and made the food taste really delicious. The nudges worked initially, but it didn't lead to sustained behavior change. Making the food taste delicious led to sustained behavior change. And so in some ways we're grappling with this very complicated problem that has some simple solutions. And sometimes it's like, well, do we have political will or money to do that? And that ends up being a lot of the story. Because there are ways to make fruits and vegetables taste great. It's just the schools are often under-resourced. And that's a lot of the story.
Many of the recent comments sort of touched on your point about what we're losing is the act of eating or the act of cooking being enjoyable in a social experience. I mean, we're all glued to our devices, and eating is just a way of sort of making sure that we can go on. And at the same time, people are looking for more meaning in their lives. And so to have sort of more mindful eating, maybe partly through the act of cooking and teaching our children how to cook, and making it a social experience. I think sort of all of these things could feed into each other, and I think a lot of you are sort of looking for solutions in that direction, and I applaud those.
Go ahead.
So I just wanted to follow up on the question about what we can do locally and mention a few things. And I think Smitha is here, and she'll probably be able to speak even more eloquently in a subsequent panel. But over the last 12 years, a few kind of behavioral nudges that we have implemented that we've seen as being successful that come to mind are we got rid of trays in the dining halls so that students didn't load up with a whole pile of food and then just go sit down and then throw away the waste. And we've seen a reduction of about 25% in terms of food waste from that. We have introduced a garden. It doesn't produce enough for all the students to actually eat what comes from the garden, but it means that they know where their food is coming from. We've introduced kitchens, and we've provided funding for actual cooking implements in those kitchens so that students who are interested in cooking, they have more spaces and they have more opportunities to do that. And a couple of other things that, and these are just little nudges, but in terms of where we're going to go in the future, I want to think about what we've done that's worked in the past. And the wonderful recent development is we're shifting the balance in terms of drinks so that it used to be, when I first came here, you had a bank of soda machines, and now you have one little soda station and you have all these spa drinks and sugar-free drink options available, so it's becoming the minority. We also have this kind of hack the dining hall station where there are kind of spices and soy sauce and sriracha and stuff so that you can mix and make your own meal in the dining hall even if you don't have a kitchen. And we've seen students be a little bit more creative and inventive with that. And we also introduce regular kind of either flexitarian or vegetarian meals at least a few times each semester to make the food really delicious and with as little meat as possible, and we've seen an increase in the number of students coming for that. And there was one more thing I was going to mention. In addition to this wonderful kind of program which we've hosted every year, we also have a program where students come in and they weigh how much food you waste at the end of each meal, and we kind of have a competition and give people feedback. All the food waste goes into a translucent bin, and then we give everybody feedback at the end of the meal. Okay, this, in this meal you wasted, or we threw away X number of kilograms per person, and let's try and reduce it by this much. And then we bring that back again the next semester so that it's not just a one-off. So those are all really great programs, and I think something like this helps us to think about how we can build on all of those successes in going forward.
Thank you for the comments. I think we have time for 2 questions. If you guys go super quick, we got 1 minute. One comment? Okay, we got 1 minute left. So
a comment. Okay,
go for it.
I'll just say that when we're talking about changing behavior, I thought also, I've been a mediator all my life, and growing up on a farm and having farms all around me, but always when I was thinking about the topic of eating meat, I always felt a bit uncomfortable, because when I really thought about it, I'm not sure if it's right. It doesn't justify it. Like the killing of animals, I'm not too comfortable with it. When I go to the supermarket, when I go to the store, I see meat there, and I'm just shielded from the entire process. I see it just as a vegetable almost. I don't have to face what's going on behind. So I thought in changing behavior, is it important as well to be a bit more in people's face about showing the process? Like if you want to indulge in it, there should be no illusion of what goes on. And that happened with me as well. I had to look at what's going on, and then I got all these impressions, and that completely changed me. And after seeing that, when I go to the store now, at least I don't have an illusion. There is like the other side of it. In the media and everything, we always get the one side. Meat is good for you, you should drink milk and everything. On the other side, if you have that, at least there's some balance. So I guess there's not a question, that's more a comment.
All right, well, thank you for the comment. That's perfect. We don't have time for any more comments from the panelists. Thank you very much.